It's Monday, the 9th of December. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the BLANCOLIRIO channel, and I'm getting a lot of questions and requests for information on this crash, the loss of Steve Mensch and his Vans RV-12iS aircraft, November 702 Delta Papa. Here's what little we know so far. All we know so far from the Aviation Safety Network is that the aircraft crashed on a road and flipped inverted near Homosassa, Florida, and the pilot was killed. Other than that, all we really have is a very erratic ADS-B flight track of this flight. This is going to be considered a high-profile crash because Steve Mensch was well known in the film industry as the president of Tyler Perry Studios out of Atlanta, Georgia. He's been there, I believe, since 2016. The aircraft that Steve was flying was the Vans RV-12iS, a very popular light sport aircraft. The latest version of this, powered by the Rotax 100 horsepower fuel-injected engine. These aircraft come both in a certified version, which you can buy from the factory, or an experimental version where you can build the aircraft yourself from this kit. Doing a little more research on Facebook, I found on the RV-12 Builders group, which I'm a member of, as we've been building an RV-12 out here in the hangar, showing some kids how to build an airplane. And it appears that Steve built his own RV-12 Delta Papa and has been flying it for a few years now. Looking at the FAA database, it looks like he does have a private pilot's license with a third-class medical, but it looks like he's been flying for a couple of years. So here's some of the comments from the Facebook RV-12 page. Jason writes that he's a really nice guy. I chatted with him multiple times in the hangar about hangars in the Atlanta area, and he helped me out with tips for my first flight. I know he loved his RV-12, and he put a ton of hours on her in the first year he had it. So it sounds like this was not a brand new aircraft to Steve, and it sounds like that he also built the aircraft himself. Here's a closer look at the RV-12 Classic version that we're building in the hangar here at the airport. Here's an RV-12 project we've been working on here in the hangar, getting some kids some experience building airplanes, sheet metal airplanes. It's a real easy kit to put together. The holes are all pre-drilled and located, and the kit literally snaps together, and it uses a lot of pop rivets or blind rivets in its design. But it uses, relatively lightweight aluminum, 020 and 032 aluminum, because the whole entire airplane only weighs about 750 pounds when empty. So we're looking at the center section here. The two seats go right here, left and right. Flight controls go inside of here, and then an engine forward of that. But it is a lightweight monocoque construction out of all aluminum, and so in the event of a crash, they do crumple up fairly easily. And typically here you have a built-up box section roll bar made out of aluminum to protect you in the event of a rollover. But forward that is just the canopy itself. Here's a look at the wings. Wingtip design here, and the spars slide through the center section and connect to each other, crisscrossing each other, making a very strong spar center section. Flaperon design, full span flaperons. Back in here we have the tail cone to the RV-12. Here's a look at the tail cone section, a very lightweight yet strong monocoque construction, kind of like an ice cream cone, which is strong, but if you dent it and then put the structure and then load the structure with compression, it will crumple like a soda can. Now in this picture, following the crash, it looks like Steve's RV-12 is in relatively intact condition, though it looks like perhaps the engine may have penetrated the cabin area, killing the pilot, or did first responders remove the engine or the whole front portion of the aircraft in order to get Steve out of the aircraft. And here you can see that roll bar area protecting that portion of the aircraft. There are a bunch of service bulletins on the RV-12 aircraft that builders are very familiar with, and the NTSB will be able to easily look through this aircraft as it's still in such pretty good shape to see if these various service bulletins were complied with and or if any of them were a factor in this crash. But what makes very little sense to me and most others is this erratic flight path that Steve flew on his final flight, which culminated in a series of very low altitude, low and slow maneuvering just prior to crashing. If we go back and look at his last 4 flights or so, we see a pretty normal point A to point B sort of flight plan. Here's one from 30 November. Here's one from 5 December. It looks like a series of touch and goes there. And Friday, 6 December, along cross country from the Atlanta area down to Florida. I presume he lived down here. On the night that he crashed, Steve took off from the airport that he had previously landed at, George T. Lewis, or CDK Airport, and started the flight proceeding northbound. Now, it doesn't give what his destination was. Was he headed back towards Georgia? It looks like he climbs up to 4,200 feet northbound and then descends down to 2,300 feet. Is that for weather? We don't know. It looks like there's weather to the north of him. And then decides to turn around and proceed southbound. It looks like he's got a pretty good tailwind now, and he proceeds southbound for quite some time. Now, because this altitude is so level, this looks to me that he has the autopilot on. It's very common to have an autopilot in these small aircraft. And then from 2,300 feet, he descends down to 1,500 feet, does another 180-degree turn, proceeds northbound. Is he just sightseeing along the coast here? 1,500 feet, descending down to 1,000 feet. By the way, a lot of this flight is out over the water on this single-engine experimental aircraft at night, something I would not consider doing. He's not very far off of the coast, but he is nevertheless over the water. And then he descends out of 1,000 feet down to 500 feet, and look at those ground speeds. Very, very slow ground speeds. 46, 47, 48 miles an hour. He's not registering hardly any altitude at all. And he begins doing a series of maneuvers at a very low and very slow altitude. So at this point, it appears to me that he's hand flying the aircraft, and it appears to me that he also has good control of the aircraft, is that he's able to maintain this low and slow airspeed and altitude combination until he hits the road near the trailer park. And if we look at the ADS-B track log here on FlightAware, we see the aircraft climbing up to 4,225 feet or so, and then descending down to 2,250 feet. But with the data being so consistent, both in heading and on altitude, this all appears to be with the autopilot on. Autopilot on, autopilot on. Then he begins this descent down to about 1,000 feet or so, and then slows the aircraft down, 950, here we go, at 950 feet, descending, and now we begin to see all the different heading changes. Very low altitudes, altitude so low that the ADS-B is not even recording, and ground speeds as low as 35 or 36 knots, which the RV-12 can do. And then eventually the thing pays off at 200 feet. Well, no, the altitude drops off and the ground speed continues very slow until impact. A very unusual and relatively unexplainable flight path. We don't yet know what the weather was at the time of the accident. We know that it was dark. Was this spatial disorientation in the darkness? Typically, the classic spatial disorientation crash scenario is a ever-tightening, what's known as a graveyard spiral of the aircraft just turning continuously until it impacts the ground. I don't see that in this particular flight path. Very erratic, hand-flown flight path. Also, too, if this was some sort of an engine problem, well, you would have had a steady descent into a crash landing. The last part of Steve's flight over the water here and then over the marshes means he was over some very dark terrain or area. Not a lot of lights to help you find the horizon until you get over here by Highway 19. The ADS-B data drops off here near Homosassa, but the crash site puts him over here at West White Dogwood Road, right near Highway 19 and 98. And Steve was flying this low and slow flight regime for well over 15 minutes. The overall flying time of the flight was just over 2 hours, about 2 hours and 15 minutes. The RV-12, if he took off with full tanks, could have easily handled that. Should have had nearly 4 hours range fuel on board the aircraft. Did Steve get lost or disoriented in an attempt to return to the airport that he took off from? Was he desperately seeking to land here near the area where he crashed, thinking that was an airport? So the NTSB will be able to fairly easily determine if there was anything wrong with the airplane that could have precluded normal flight. They'll be looking closely at the weather. Was it just simply night VFR weather? If that was the case, if there was nothing wrong with the airplane, and if the weather was just simply night VFR, then they're going to start looking at Steve himself. And one of the things they're going to be concerned about was Steve fit to fly that evening. And here we're reminded by the FAA FAST team of the I'm Safe checklist. Was he suffering from any sort of illness? Was he on any kind of medication? Under a certain undue amount of stress? Something going on there at work, at the studios? Was alcohol involved? Fatigue? Some emotional issue going on with his life? These are the kind of things that pilots cannot be bothered with going flying with. You have to be fit to fly. So a very strange accident to review, very erratic flight path. Why was Steve flying at or below 500 feet at night, low and slow, just above the stall speed for the RV-12iS, maneuvering erratically until finally crashing here? Was Steve fit to fly this evening? Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.